Excuse my voice, I was doing a lot of yelling last night. So I'll be talking about racism at home and abroad and how we make these connections for our class. Racism as perpetrated by the U.S. state, whether by police domestically or by the CIA, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. military, and other countries, operates the same way. The foundation of racialized violence is to lie about the victim, and these lies always follow a similar pattern. We are told that the primary target of U.S. state violence is a violent thug, that they come from a broken culture that produces criminality, and we're told that the use of violent force is a net benefit of to the targeted community at large. Everyone in this room understands this. Many of you have written on this subject and you've documented the lies of the U.S. state in detail. What bears discussion is how this information is communicated to the masses at large. The road to socialism is through the people. The road to socialism is through organizing the masses, through educating them about the political character of their oppression and identifying their class enemies. By collectivizing and educating the masses, we can then concentrate our forces against the capitalist ruling class and engage in revolutionary struggle. But this requires that we explain to folks that their oppression is directly linked with the oppression faced by people living thousands of miles away. Further, we have to explain that this link goes beyond moral empathy. Someone living in New York City can easily understand why the lynching of indigenous people in Bolivia is wrong. They don't need Marxists to help them understand that. But what may not be clear is how the overthrow of a democratic government in Bolivia is part of the same neoliberal program that brought 500 new cops to our subway platforms. Right. And further, that a defeat of the forces of imperialism in Bolivia is a victory for oppressed people here. Our job is to provide this clarity. So the focus of my talk will be on the way that domestic and international state repression mirror each other. Because I found that explaining that the way these struggles mirror each other resonates really strongly with people who are new to this struggle. One of the most important things to communicate to people when organizing is that racism is motivated by the material interests of the ruling class, right? Liberals have been extremely effective at spreading the myth that racism is driven by individual hatred. Under the liberal model, if we want to determine if someone's a racist, we have to perform a heart exam, right? We have to find out if they're truly racist in their heart, right? That's the only way to know that someone is engaging in racism. But this false paradigm leads to a confusing and unproductive discussion where people end up debating whether or not all cops are racist or whether some of them are redeemable. So it's important for us as Marxists to refocus this discussion on the material dimension, specifically the extraction of wealth. Right? So the police in the U.S. exist to protect the ruling class, and they exist to extract wealth from the ruling class, especially the black and brown community. The current struggle in the MTA serves as a very clear example of this. And doing some outreach and organizing, we've had this conversation with people on the street, right? So Wall Street desperately wants to continue collecting debt service from MTA fares. However, due to crumbling infrastructure and increasing poverty, the working class is less and less likely to tolerate a toll for public transportation. So the only way that Wall Street can continue to extract wealth from the working class is by injecting 500 police officers onto subway platforms. And use violence to force black and brown people to pay for a service that barely works. People in the community intuitively understand this. What's important is then making the connection that this process repeats itself in other countries. So For example, as the environmental crisis worsens, there's an incredible demand for non-fossil fuel energy sources. These alternative energy sources rely on battery power storage, and one of the primary components of rechargeable batteries is lithium. The people of Bolivia have the fortune and the misfortune of living on top of one of the world's largest stores of lithium. Evo Morales understood that national ownership of Bolivia's lithium could provide his country with an increasing standard of living while helping the rest of the world convert to green energy. But such an arrangement would deny U.S. and European companies profit from the mining of lithium, and therefore this arrangement was intolerable. U.S. economic policy demands that U.S. and European companies have unfettered access to the resources of the global South and the profits that go along with it. So, as is the case with the MTA on the subway, in order to extract those profits and wealth, what the emerging picture seems to be is that the U.S. backed a right-wing military, police, and militia forces in Bolivia to force Evo Morales out of office and make room for a Christo-fascist government that would ensure U.S. and European economic control in Bolivia. So these coup forces have used anti-indigenous racism as a rallying standard for their movement. Whether we're talking about La Paz, Bolivia, or New York City, racism serves the goal of capitalist wealth extraction. Another thing that I think works really well to create this connection between oppressed peoples here and there, and to talk about racist lies, is to talk about thugs, dictators, and thuggish dictators, right? Because the U.S. doesn't present itself as an evil empire. In spite of its immense crimes against humanity, it claims to be the leading moral force in the world. So the murder of black and brown people in the U.S. and the overthrow of foreign governments needs to be justified as moral acts. And the way that the U.S. does this is by lying and slandering the victims of U.S. aggression. But again, we all know this, but by drilling down on specifically the language, people, particularly in the black and brown community, see themselves mirrored in the struggle because they see a mirror of the lies that are being told about them, being told about other people. So you talk to black and brown people in New York specifically, or in the U.S. generally, they automatically know what you're talking about when you use the phrase, "he was no angel," right? After the police kill someone, he was no angel. They understand the racialized nature of the term thug, right? They know that these terms reinforce, that the police use these terms to reinforce the concept of black criminality. They know that after an unarmed person of color is killed by the police, their personal records will be searched for any infraction, no matter how minor, no matter how unrelated, to smear their character. This character assassination, which follows physical assassination, is done to justify state violence and to make white people feel comfortable about the actions of the state. And oppressed peoples within the United States understand this, so it's important to explain that the U.S. follows the same pattern of violence and slander in other countries. Countries that use their resources primarily for the benefit of their own people rather than for the benefit of U.S. countries do not have democratically elected presidents and prime ministers, if we're listening to the U.S. media, right? The U.S. State Department and their propaganda arm in the media will only ever refer to these leaders as dictators, no matter how many votes they receive. And these dictators are not the heads of governments or administrations. They're the leaders of regimes, right? What I'm talking, sometimes brutal regimes. And so what I'm talking about here is that I want to help, when I'm communicating with people, when I'm organizing with people, I want them to hear, when they hear dictator, they should also hear thug, you know? It's the same exact thing. As a matter of fact, the lines of the parallels are so close that they actually intersect sometimes when you hear the term thuggish dictator, right? So it's a racial dog whistle. It's a racial dog whistle. Another dog whistle, and this is one that upsets me a lot personally, is corruption. So foreign governments, especially in Africa and Latin America, are said to be plagued by corruption. The use of the word plague implies an infliction, something that becomes part of a person that they can't control. What's really being said here is that Black and Latinx people cannot be put in a position of responsibility and control themselves and prevent themselves from stealing at every opportunity that they have, right? That we have like this moral inferiority that you just can't put us in charge, and we can't be in charge of our own communities, and we can't be in charge of our own countries. And so you need this white paternalistic guidance, right, to root out corruption. And a lot of times these allegations of corruption are completely manufactured. I mean, every socialist government is apparently plagued by corruption, like every single one. And so this is the same racist ideology that argues that Black and brown people in the US suffer from poverty, crime, and a lack of education for cultural reasons, right? When Fox News talks about that there's a cultural problem in the Black community, it's the same pathology, that there's something inherently wrong with Black and Latinx people. But Black and brown people don't steal for cultural reasons here or abroad. They're not poor for cultural reasons in North America or South America. Black and brown people in the US and abroad are stolen from. They are made poor by the thievery of the ruling class in the US state. Black and brown people here understand that this is the case in the United States. We need to make the connection that this is happening outside. And then lastly, probably the primary moral appeal is to invoke sympathy for innocent bystanders within a targeted community. During the height of the war on drugs, the incredible violence used against mostly Black men was justified as a means of protecting the larger Black community. The victims of police violence were skillfully divided from their own population through the use of clever language. The police told us that drug dealers were poisoning their community, right? The idea is that the targeted individuals, the victims of police violence, are not members of their community, but rather that they are aberrant predators who are inflicting harm on other people, and that those innocent people are people we should pity. So actually, if we're moral, we should encourage the police to commit acts of violence on these, these super predators who are separate and different. We have to explain that this language that says that thugs and drug dealers are poisoning their own communities comes from the same template as the phrase dictators who gas their own people. It's the same moral appeal, right? It's the U.S. is able to mask their racism, engaging in violent war against foreign countries by saying, listen, we actually pity the people of these foreign countries, but there are aberrant members of their community, these dictators who receive 0 votes, who govern through violent totalitarianism, and they're a plague upon their community, and we can isolate them through targeted sanctions and targeted bombing and separate them from the community for the protection of the civilian people in their country. And it just goes sort of without saying that when we talk about the poisoning of communities or the gassing of people, we don't talk about the Flint water crisis, we don't talk about depleted uranium in Iraq, right? The most poisoning of the community comes from the capitalist class, but it's a line of propaganda that works really well. And if you look at polling prior to the Iraq War, the only demographic that broke 50% against the war prior to it happening were African Americans, because they intuitively have that distrust, because they're always being portrayed by the media as the villains. So when that same media turns around and calls someone a villain, there's that second of hesitation, like, well, if they lied about me, maybe they're lying about other people too. We have to build on that second of hesitation and say, your instinct is absolutely right. What's necessary as we build towards socialist revolution is to explain to the masses who their class enemies are and who are their allies. We must organize the working class into political mass organizations that have the power to take control of the means of production. Class consciousness is higher today than it has ever been in decades. But there is a tremendous amount of political education that still needs to be done. We cannot effectively organize the working class if they don't understand that the people of Bolivia are part of the international working class. They can't fight against the ruling class unless they understand that the folks in the South Bronx are on the exact same side as the folks in La Paz, and that the NYPD and the CIA are two sides of the same coin. Making these connections is not just important for solidarity, it's important because it provides clarity in the struggle. It prevents future contradictions from emerging within the struggle, such as the contradiction between people of color who are U.S. citizens and people of color who are undocumented. And it inoculates the working class from attempts at co-option and controlled opposition by NGOs, the Democratic Party, and Social Democrats, because those forces are totally incapable of standing up against U.S. imperialism. The road to socialism is through agitation, education, and organization of the masses. An essential part of that is explaining that U.S. racism respects no borders. That's all I have to say for today. Thank you. Someone mentioned during Q&A, but the most important thing to remember about the demonstration we had last night was that the 58 arrests and the injuries, and it was actually a bloody scene. That was caused by the police. And so it's important for us as our movement to never turn on each other and always understand that this outward police repression is the primary issue. So briefly, I just want to say that at PPA, we've been trying to get our head around this concept of deep organizing. And it's relevant here because I think when you talk about having a mass mobilization in a community, how do you make that something that is safe? How do you make it something that is what Taryn called a people's democracy, where there's buy-in and where the people there feel like there's ownership? In New York City, whenever there's a protest in the outer boroughs as opposed to downtown Manhattan, there's always reports of increased police repression in those Black and brown neighborhoods in the weeks that follow. So essentially, we come and we protest and we sort of celebrate, and then we leave, and the police are still there, and the people who live there have to suffer with that. And so the conversation that we've been having at PPA is, well, who are we going to leave behind in this neighborhood? Like, are we going to send people before and after actions to actually get to know people, to shake their hands, to have conversations, maybe, having dinner with people, going to people's homes, and, really getting to know people and explaining, the political education behind this, because they're already with us on the general message. They're standing on the side of the street screaming like, yeah, fuck the cops. Like, we totally agree with you. So they're with us, right? It's not clear. It's not clear what the road to socialism is, but that's essentially what we've come to at the PPA, is that we want to try and experiment with this. We want to build more relationships with our class, and I think that is not. It's not moving away from mobilizations like we saw last night, mobilizations like we had with Venezuela. What it is it's strengthening those mobilizations, because what we're doing essentially is that in between the mobilizations, we're getting to know people, and then we're hopefully, the idea is that we can then turn them out to the mobilizations, and it's something that represents their political and popular will. It's something that leaves them better off and stronger afterwards instead of more repressed. So that's essentially all I had to say. Kind of a brief report about what PPA is doing and what our point of view is on the struggle that happened last night. So thank you.